Why is it always cities that are liberal and small towns that are conservative? The way my political science professor answered this question when I asked it many years ago was, why cities go blue and the rural goes red? In the countryside, you have the right to swing a baseball bat around so long as you don't actually hit anyone. That's your God-given right. In the city where there are a lot more people who you need to coexist with, you want the freedom to not get struck by some maniac swinging a baseball bat around. It's a difference in how these regions interact with government services and society in general. People living in cities are used to problems being solved collectively. Your garbage is collected by the city. You walk to the subway station on a city sidewalk. Take the city-run subway system to work every day alongside a million other people, etc. I mean, even the housing is done more communally with apartments instead of large individual homes. In a rural area, it's very different. The government doesn't have anywhere as much a presence in your life. Public services in rural areas amount to a maybe paved road and the promise that if you call for help, they'll send the fire department within an hour. Problems within the community are solved on an individual level. Don't own a car and need to find a way to work? I hope your neighbor can drive you or else you're walking, and there won't even be a public sidewalk for you to use. This extends to politics. Rural areas tend to prefer policies that favor individualism. There's also the fact that cities are less homogeneous, which means you are exposed to a greater variety of people from a greater variety of backgrounds, which encourages inclusion and tolerance. It helps to keep in mind that Team Red versus Team Blue has always had a rural versus urban flavor to it. For Team Red, rural, all the things that Team Blue wants are things they just do for each other as part of being neighborly. So Team Blue literally looks like a bunch of extra taxes and regulations to help a bunch of big city neighbors who refuse to take care of each other and also want to take away guns and gasoline, diesel, things that are important for their way of life. It's not that Team Red wants to make the rich richer. It's that they're afraid Team Blue will make them poorer, while the rich get richer anyway. For Team Blue, urban, there are more neighbors than a human brain can possibly track. And it's impossible to take care of each other efficiently without delegating it to public servants and other specialists. So Team Red literally looks like a bunch of heartless racist assholes who want people in cities to starve while poisoning the air and water and murdering children in schools for some reason. As long as we continue with a two-party first-past-the-post voting system instead of a ranked choice system that allows more than two parties, game theory demands that Team Red and Team Blue keep polarizing the electorate to the fringes. Most of them start out honestly trying to make real changes. Once they get in and understand the process, you quickly realize you can't do as much as you want without the support of others. And with the support of others comes the I will scratch you back if you scratch my back mentality. And it's all downhill from there. You will have to make deals you're against to move forward. You will have to lie to someone to get the support of someone else. And so on. You can't make it to the top without making lots of enemies. There's also the problem that your constituents may accidentally force you to lie to them somewhat. If you give the voters realistic promises, then those promises will sound boring and unimpressive compared to a different candidate who is promising the moon. The electoral incentive is to overpromise and underdeliver. So the candidate who is misleading has an advantage over the candidate who is honest about what can actually be done, which of course makes everyone more cynical about everything. Making deals is not necessarily dishonest. In fact, people have to trust you to make deals with you. Each person can just be furthering the goals they were elected to do, even though they disagree with each other. Congress members do not report to anyone. If there is no top dog, All joint action is through negotiation. Yes, there are positive negotiations. But at some point you will have to compromise yourself for your career. Congress members are owned by those who donate a significant amount to their campaigns. You need lots of money to win at this level. Money comes from those that will benefit the most from electing you. Routine exposure to those who are different reduces fear and fosters empathy and understanding. You get a lot more exposure in cities than in the country. Diversity, or the lack thereof. It's a weird dynamic. Cities are filled with people who want liberal policies because the city is so unbelievably expensive to live in, and because usually they moved there, away from the families and communities which would have been their support system. They want something to step in and replace that. Cities are also filled with big businesses who want conservative policies so they can make as much profit as possible. They tend to wind up with the social policies the little people want and the big business policies the employers want. But the liberal policies get more attention. People like to show off winning, and it's a great way to get even more people to move to the city. While the conservative ones downplayed, businesses never want to advertise exactly how badly they're screwing you over. And like I said, they want you to move there and become their labor force. In small towns, with their lower costs of living, people are far more likely to own stuff and have that family and community safety net nearby. They have a sense of ownership over the entire town, so they act like the big business people in the city. They want their stuff protected from others, and for people to butt out of telling them what they can or can't do with it. Conversely, smaller towns are more likely to have liberal business policies. There are fewer workers, so they have to play nice. They are much more likely to have things like unions, which protect the workers' rights. Unions are bad for big business, so painting everyone as idiot hillbillies, and therefore conservative people are idiots, is to their advantage. It's not completely true, either of those states, or elsewhere. Fort Worth, TX is a Republican-leaning city of over 1 million people. Compare that with, e.g. Northampton, Massachusetts, or even with most of the rural areas along the Texas-Mexico border. Vermont is one of the most rural states in America, and also one of the most left-leaning. And Texas is not very red. Republicans win power in Texas pretty consistently, but also by relatively small margins. It's nothing like Wyoming, Utah, Alabama or Mississippi, or if you're looking for a state with some large metropolitan areas, Tennessee. America has urbanized heavily over the past few decades. Very few people who grew up in big cities have moved to genuinely rural areas, and those have been mostly to work in mineral extraction industries. Urban and suburban areas have grown a lot. Some of this growth has been Americans from rural areas moving to urban areas for work. But who would prefer to live in rural areas? These folks tend to live in outer suburbs. And the outer suburbs of many large American cities are about as Republican-leaning as the genuinely rural areas. Others moved because they genuinely prefer urban culture, and they tend to go to the big cities or their inner suburbs. Then there are also foreign immigrants in the big cities and inner suburbs. Psychologists have found that the personality trait, openness to experience, essentially an interest in new and different things versus traditional things, correlates strongly with political ideology, and it also correlates with preference for rural versus urban life. It won't be one-to-one with party affiliation, as, in particular, libertarian types often vote Republican, but have a high openness to experience. But it correlates pretty well, especially with the present ideological coalitions of the two parties. Pre-Reagan, it correlated much less well, as there were more socially moderate Republicans and more socially conservative Democrats. Part of being liberal is accepting other people, even if they're different. That's a much easier skill to learn when there are actually people around that are different than you. Part of being conservative is sticking to your position. That's a lot easier to do when the few people around you think the same way you do. Caring about the health and well-being of others tends to be a bigger concern when you are in close proximity. The density of cities tends to put those issues in close proximity to you. Diversity is also a large factor. Very simply, cities' people live in very close proximity to each other, so inherently, the state of one have a big effect on everyone else. There needs to be more social order when there are a lot of people in close proximity. This usually means individuals giving up some of their own freedoms for the benefit of everyone else. Whereas in small towns, there is much less of a need of social order, so people can have more freedoms. Walking into a Walmart with an open carry gun on your hip in a Chicago suburb where there are hundreds of people is a very different thing than walking into a small town general store where there are maybe 6 people, and you know all of them by name with a gun on your hip. Generally, because cities wall you off from the realities of production. You live in a city, and food just shows up at the store. You never have to think about all the work that goes into producing it. Cities also tend to have a lot less community. You don't meet your neighbors, or help them, or work as a community to do anything. So people tend to think of government solutions first, instead of taking care of a problem locally. There are a ton of other factors involved, of course, but these are fairly important ones. It's really not a US thing. I live in Europe and we have the same pattern. Big cities are left-leaning and farmers and other PPL living in small communities are right-leaning. Now the definition here of left and right-leaning will not give meaning in the US context, as you would see almost everyone as way over on the left wing, but that's a cultural thing. I think it's something about country folk tend to think of their place as their castle, and big city folks see that if you don't try to get along with the crowd around them, then stuff don't work out too well. Add to this that all the large cities here have all the education centers, so there will be a lot of younger and more educated voters there, and you got the same thing as in the US. Big city equals bigger perspective, small town equals smaller perspective. Austin is liberal, but I would push back on it as one of the most liberal. And as an example, Austin is home to 52 KUT students who graduate and stay in town. Young people tend to be more liberal. Here's my theory. Think of political ideology as a contagious disease. Diseases spread more easily when there are more people closer together. Liberals, progressives, want to affect change, which is aided by the larger populations of cities. Conservatives do not want to cause change and are more spread out in suburbs and rural areas than in cities, making them slightly more closed off and detached from potential social movements. Sounds rude, but smart and ambitious people gravitate towards cities, and also tend to be more progressive. This is true throughout all of history, everywhere. A lot of people will say diversity, but really it's not all true. Cities tend to have a much younger population overall, students, etc. Younger people tend to vote more liberal than conservative. There is also the fact that a lot of liberal policies do not advantage rural people whatsoever, if not disadvantage them outright. If a politician runs on a platform of better public transportation, that means nothing for rural folks who will not get any benefits from that service and will probably end up paying for it somehow. Of course, such issues are lesser in Europe, where even rural towns have public transportation in some form. But in a much less dense country like the US or Canada, it would not be economically sound or even feasible to pay for public transport services to these rural locations. Of course there are other factors, but these two are major, in my opinion. You see more than 15 people in a given day. You see how more people live their lives. You see how interconnected we are with the people and world around us. You get the distinct sensation that people are truly unfortunate despite being good, and you see that it could have been you like that, and you want to build a world where you'll have a chance too. If fate conspires against you, and that means caring for people you don't know by setting up systems of governance that try to be fair to everyone. Rural areas tend to be less educated. Less educated people tend to skew conservative. In cities there is really no other choice than to work together for the common good. In more rural areas you often have to be more self-reliant. Those are the two main differences in political philosophy. Everything else, with some exceptions, flows from that. Suburbs, towns, and rural areas attract people who want to live more independently. There's a lower cost of living, more space, and more you have to do for yourself. These things tend to appeal more to conservative people. Cities attract people who want to live more socially independently. There's a high cost of living, more population density, more public services, and more convenience. These things tend to appeal more to liberal and especially left-leaning people. Exposure.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. CuriousCast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.